And then there was the Reverend Chauncey Kilmer Meyers of Manhattan's Lower East Side. His Lower East Side Neighborhood Association was the focal point of his own memoirs, Light the Dark Streets, published in 1957, 2 years after he had established a formal peace treaty between opposing gang factions in 1955, covered by the press. Gang historian Kwame Welsh describes the roots of the cause of the conflict between the sportsmen and the Forsyth Street Boys, as well as the involvement of another gang, the Dragons, and how they figured into the eventual conflict between the sportsmen, the Forsyth Street Boys, and the tragedy that befell Teresa G., as well as several other teenagers on that fateful August 23, 1959. And we are just having an informal discussion about 1950s youth gangs, particularly the Forsyth Street Boys and Sportsmen, the roots of that gang war in '59. But you had mentioned that it actually goes by farther, right?
Well, if you want to start someplace, let's start 4 years earlier. 1955, Dr. Schneider, in the book Vampires, Dragons, and Egyptian Kings, he mentions that there were 45 gangs in the Lower East Side at that time. For other references, you have material from the Death and Life of Great Cities by Jane Jacobs. She gives some more background material on those wars that were going on at that time as well. So you had what I call homegrown gangs that had started in the Lower East Side, and then you also had gangs that had come primarily out of Harlem. So they brought their rivalries with them. As far as I know, the Sportsmen had started on the Lower East Side, and the Dragons came from Harlem.
Now, when you mentioned the Dragons,
Yes.
this is the same Dragons in the Michael Farmer case that you're of that opinion.
Yes.
And you're also of
definitely.
the opinion that this is the same Dragons involved in the 50, oh God, was it 59, 58, 59, the shooting of Raul Barucci
Yes.
that Carmen Martinez participated in.
Yes. We have to go back. We cannot start in the 50s because if we start in the 50s, we lose sight of all of the connections and all of the alliances in the 50s. The Egyptian kings, the newspapers make them look like they're just a bunch of little punks.
Yeah.
It was indeed a small division. But, and this is a big but, we also know that the Egyptian kings had started in the 40s. So they're one of the earliest gangs involved in that war.
Now, is this the late 40s, you think? Like after the war?
Yes, I would think it was the late 40s.
And you mentioned that they copied military structure.
Street gangs were copying the U.S. Army structure and the division.
Yeah.
The U.S. Army, some of the gang members, their brothers and fathers and uncles would come back from the war, maybe on leave, and they would see them wearing divisional patches. So the gangs came up with the idea, let's start up our own divisions. There was this illustrious character by the name of Little Abner, and he wanted to make the Dragons, he's the founder of the Dragons, but he wanted to make the Dragons the first citywide Puerto Rican gang. Other gangs that were already citywide were like the Saints, which were primarily Irish and in some cases Italian. But the Saints were widespread. They were all over. The Jesters were, as far as I know, only in 2 boroughs. But the Saints were in Long Island, they were in Jersey, they were everywhere. So you had others like the Dukes. There were some Dukes that kind of split off from each other over time. Just think about any nobleman name they had them back then, and a lot of those noble names
Or those,
were the citywide.
You had names like Corsair Lords and things like that,
And they were connected.
Yeah.
For people to say that they were not connected And I gave this little example when I interviewed the Duke of Doo-Wop about 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
He was from Astoria, Queens himself. And I said, this is an analogy. You're part of a Saints gang in the Central Bronx, or what they used to call the East Bronx back in those days. Your family packs up and goes to Queens. Do you think that kid quits the gang? No. He goes and he starts up another chapter or a division in Queens, and now he's naming it Ridgewood Saints because they're living in Ridgewood, Queens.
It's similar to the Mau Mau's. They had to ask the president of the Chaplains, correct?
Yes. Because
Yeah.
the Chaplains was the primary gang in that projects.
Yeah.
So they were deferring to the Chaplain. And for those who have not visited New York, parts of the Lower East Side are jokingly called Alphabet City because some of the main streets are named after the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and that's it. Then you have the river, East River, and the streets progress up to probably about 14th Street, or in some cases, some of the gangs later on up to 20th Street were considered part of the Lower East Side. So you have a space that's, the maximum 20 blocks long, maybe 10 blocks wide. It's not that large a place to have all these different gangs. So when the gangs had gathered post 1955, they started making alliances among themselves. And at the very beginning, the Forsyth Street Boys were actually allies with the Sportsmen against the Dragons. The Dragons were seen as invaders from Harlem, where they were originally from, while the Forsyth Street Boys and the Sportsmen were what I would consider homegrown gangs. But somehow during the conflict, the Forsyth Street Boys switched sides and became the main enemy of the Sportsmen, which was the largest black gang in the area. I'm not sure of the entire amount of Sportsmen, but I have at least 4 black divisions and a white division called the Top Hatters, which was on the northeastern part of the territory.